I really challenged myself creating some of my best work so far. Starting with studies, I did 4 main types of studies: perspective studies, expression studies, posing studies, and refining my art style. Since I struggled so much with perspective last year, we'll focus on perspective studies. All of my studies were 1-point perspective, but despite this, I was still able to grow my understanding of how perspective works a lot. As always, I forgot to use references for most of my studies. However, when I did remember to use them, I ended up with a decent end product with a clear perspective. I'm slowly getting more confident with drawing backgrounds, as you'll see later in the video. As the focus of most drawings, I decided that I'd benefit from going over the head again, specifically the expressions of the face. I focused on the eyes, as that is arguably both one of the most important parts of the face to subtly express emotions and one of the most stylized parts of my art style. I started my expression studies by only drawing the eyes, and then I drew the other features of the face. I also tried to draw the face looking up for the first time, which actually went better than I thought it would. There's definitely something wrong with it, but overall I'm quite happy with how it turned out. I actually struggled more with the hair than the face since I didn't know what to do with it. If you have any tips, please put them in the comments section. Further into the month, I realised that I'd never drawn heads from the side angle, and so decided to do some side profile studies of the skull. They looked quite funky at the start, but eventually started looking more normal. Moving on from expression studies, I continued doing gesture studies using the Posemaniacs website. I noticed that I would always struggle with proportions. This is especially the case with the legs. When I noticed this in drawing 100 poses in a week video, I decided to combat it by drawing the head and then the legs first, and then drawing everything else, so then I'd have a clear top and bottom of the drawing. However, this time I increased the timer by another 25 seconds, making it a minute in total, and I drew the lines for all the major limbs so that I'd know roughly how long they need to be. I still have issues making the limbs too wide, but the length issues were resolved, making my studies much more effective as I could focus on fixing the actual pose rather than the proportions. Throughout January, I also wanted to refine my art style. I focused on a lot while doing this, from the eyes to how I draw grass. In December's video, I said that I wanted to start working on environmental design, and so I started experimenting with how I draw nature, trying out different ways and seeing what I would like most. Previously, I struggled a lot with this, especially when drawing grass. I don't want to draw every single strand, but I also don't know how to make the strands seamless. This meant that they would stand out a lot and just look wrong overall. I tried a few different ways of fixing this issue and eventually decided on using a textured brush that I use for shading to make the grass. As stated previously, I wanted to improve my heads and so did some studies on improving my eyes. However, I also worked on other parts of the head. In December, I brought the artist tribute to Hokusai and got really inspired by a lot of the work I was seeing. One thing that stuck out to me was how the artist Loloko made the nose and cheeks a red colour. I tried to replicate this in these 2 head studies, and I've now implemented them into my art style. I also changed how I use liner. I don't like using liner in the final piece for anything but the hair, and even then, I actually like an unconventional approach for this, making the liner much lighter than the actual colour of the hair. I also found that I like making the hair liner a noise texture brush rather than a normal non-textured brush. With all of these studies and art style changes in mind, we'll now go on to the many full drawings I made this month. This section will be more in depth about what I like and what I learned about each drawing. It will also include the best drawing I've done so far, so stay tuned for that. I started the month with this drawing an animal for the first time in a full piece, which I'm actually quite proud of. However, I noticed one big issue, which is the composition. It feels so boring despite having interesting elements to it. The character is in the center, but the magic circle things are to the side, creating a lack of balance in the piece. I haven't studied composition yet, as I don't draw characters with backgrounds very often, but this is clearly causing issues, so I'll need to study it soon. However, I really like the colours used, and I also really like the character's hair. I'm super bad at drawing the hair, especially the hair at the back of the head, so I'm really proud of how this turned out. Moving on to my next drawing, which was my attempt to draw flowers, which, as you can see, did not go to plan. I actually own a book on how to draw flowers because of how bad I am at it. This piece was loosely inspired by another piece in the artist tribute by Meng Xuan Li. Flowers are something that I really want to work on in the future, but at this point they just don't look good. Some of the flowers don't look too bad, while others are painful to look at. As always, I didn't use a reference when making this drawing, which really impacted the quality of it. Because of this drawing, I decided to continue working on nature and figuring out how I wanted to stylize it in the next drawing. Previously, I would use a leaf brush to make trees and brushes, however I felt that it was way too generic and didn't fit in with my art style, especially as I don't usually put much detail into my drawings. You can see this through the difference between the grass and bushes, which make the drawing look super disjointed. This will be resolved in the future. I also want to highlight the movement in this piece. I love movement in art and try to use the ribbons in order to implement that into my own work. You'll probably see more of this in my future pieces as I try to integrate it more often. Although I didn't finish this piece, I still quite enjoyed making it and experimenting with different things from nature to movement. This piece also isn't finished, but it was a perspective study which I'm actually quite proud of. It was my first attempt at drawing multiple characters in one scene and the precursor to arguably the best drawing I've ever made. I did more experimentation with drawing the grass, which I think was successful. The trees are an obvious problem which I still haven't resolved yet, as I don't know what to do with the leaves specifically. You'll see in a lot of my old pieces that when a tree is present, I purposefully don't draw leaves. This is so I can avoid this issue rather than resolve it. In this piece, I did try to resolve it head on and think that the leftmost tree turned out pretty decently. However, the shape of the other tree definitely had a negative impact on how it turned out. This was one of my first attempts at incorporating water in a full drawing, which I'm also really proud of. Usually, I try avoiding clouds as I really struggle to draw them, but this time I tried to incorporate them, which went okay. They're definitely something I need to improve on in the near future, but they look fine at this point in time. Moving on to the best drawing I've ever made, both because of how it looks and because of how challenging it was to make and how much I learned in the process. Incorporated flowers, a background, posing, and by extension anatomy and hands and composition. As said previously, I've never studied composition before, so this drawing was very challenging, but the thing I struggled most with was actually making sure it wasn't too busy. In the original sketch, the foreground features were a lot more prominent, and there was a pile of bones in the background. Eventually, I deemed them a bit too distracting and got rid of the pile of bones and made the foreground elements go further within the drawing. I also removed some of the flowers as there were originally many more. I'm not obsessed with the characters as I feel that their design is really basic. I actually went back to the drawing several times after I declared it done because I hated how simple the clothes were. Ignoring their clothes, I'm quite happy with how the characters turned out. I love his hair and think, especially when zoomed in, their expressions are quite good. I actually experimented with adding eye cutouts to make the expression even clearer, inspired by comics and manga panels. Picking the colours was also a bit challenging as the values for the background was too light for most of the drawing process. After checking my values, I fixed this by making the foreground elements less saturated and the background much darker. It took a while to get the pose correct as I'm not confident with anatomy at all, let alone posing. However, I think that my gesture studies definitely benefited me in drawing this, as I feel their poses aren't too stiff. I think this piece has good storytelling elements with the swords in the ground in both the background and the foreground, as well as the dead guy on the right. I actually studied the side profile of the skull specifically for this piece, but chose not to include it both as the pile of bones were removed and as I decided not to make the dead guy a skeleton, but instead someone who had lost his life force and by extension all of the colour in his skin. Overall, I'm super proud of this drawing. It was a real challenge and took almost 6 hours to do, but it was totally worth the effort. Finishing this drawing inspired me to start many others that had elements that I normally wouldn't draw, such as the body not being at a front-facing angle or drawing my male OC, which I almost never do. The final drawings are my designs for Sebastian and Sylvie. I changed Sebastian's design to be more muscular as I felt that he looked like a twink, which wasn't what I was going for. I also finished my design for Sylvie, which I love. For both of these character designs, I used the method I explained in my December art evaluation video, but the long story short is that I made thumbnails, picked which one I liked the most, and ran with it. I'm happy with my progress so far. There'll be a full video coming out in February showcasing my growth in 2025, but comparing my work in January 2026 to December 2025, there has been a clear improvement. In December, I was still too cautious around posing, causing me to draw basic pieces and preventing me from growing. I also didn't really do any drawings with background, so this was a great jump. For February, my goals will be, as always, to continue working on posing, anatomy, and perspective, but I also want to start looking at composition to try something new. Okay, so that was everything I did to improve my art in January 2026. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, then please like and subscribe to be notified when my next videos come out and to support my channel. Bye bye!